Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning, Tom. Good morning, Helena.
Hello, good morning.
Hello.
Okay, good morning.
Good morning.
It looks like we have a good group. Just a reminder, the meeting is set up so that you join muted, but you can unmute yourself at any time. Probably works better if most of us stay muted when we're not talking, just to cut down on background noise and crosstalk. But so far this has worked well. So welcome to our virtual B session on health and socioeconomic systems. So we're following up on the A sessions, and really kind of an arbitrary boundary, but what we're trying to do is talk about synthesis of physics, ecosystems, health, and socioeconomic systems, working towards integrated models that can answer stakeholder questions about all aspects of oil spills in the Gulf. So today I'd like to do just a quick round of introductions, and then I'll talk a little bit about kind of the overview of what we're doing, although I'll abbreviate that since I think most of you have already been through at least one A session. And I want to spend most of the time talking about what are the refinements to the system diagrams that we might make beyond what we've already done in the A sessions, and what's the coverage of models in that space, and how do we get the missing pieces? What are the highest priority models? What's the strategy for getting them? So I'll share some material, primarily reviewing what we've done so far and throwing up some preliminary straw dog thoughts about the missing models, but I hope this will be substantially a discussion and kind of a creative brainstorming process. Okay, so our goal is to support synthesis, and here's an example of the task. This is one of the Sea Grant stakeholder questions. And actually there are a lot, there's kind of a whole constellation of questions that basically center around what do dispersants do, and should we use them? Are they making things better or worse? So this appears in the list, framed in a variety of ways. How do the dispersants enter the food chain? What's the exposure to first responders, and so forth. And certainly there are models already that answer some questions about this. And actually, if you look at the publications, there are lots of publications about dispersants as well, and some of them are very highly cited. But there isn't really a dispersant tool that gives you an end-to-end answer about this. So you know, you can physically model the plume and what the dispersant does to it, and what that does downstream to oil entrained and circulating more widely, and what that does to ecosystems. But by the time you get to what's the implications for health or for local economies, there are a lot of possible kind of causal pathways to consider, and not all of those are in a single tool. So there isn't something that gives a decision maker a single opinion about what to do about this yet. And of course, well, the way that question or that kind of question might get answered these days is not through a single tool, but through a network of connections between decision makers and scientists. So this is a view from Sea Grant's social network analysis of essentially influence of researchers into the decision-making space. So part of the task is to build up this network, but then if you don't want to ask a scientist for an opinion every time you have a question, what you'd also like to do is start essentially automating this network with models that span the full space and ultimately transplant the understanding in the scientist's head into the decision makers' heads. And of course, we don't just have dispersant questions, we have a whole network of questions. So this is a tag network of a full list of Sea Grant stakeholder questions. The blue items are on the left are all about physics and transport. Moving into the ecosystem in yellow, kind of the top right, and then mainly through coupling through the ecosystems, you get to human health in green and socioeconomic systems in orange. It's kind of interesting that the questions naturally self-organize into this 4-box structure. So this is the conceptual framework we've been using with models roughly organized into physics, ecosystems, human health, and socioeconomic systems, but with a lot of spillover between them, especially because interventions may use information from one box to make decisions in another and have multiple effects on different aspects of the system. So as we think about building models, we're always asking ourselves, and I'll just repeat these as kind of a reminder of some things to keep in mind as we're talking about models today. Who's the audience? Who's going to make a decision on the basis of the information that's available, or who owns the question that you're trying to answer, and what other stakeholders might be involved or at least affected by the decisions they're going to make. And then once you know that, what's the question you're trying to answer, what's the time horizon, what level of detail is needed to answer it, and so on. There are lots of questions of scale. And then there are also questions about logistics. How do we get the data? Who runs the model? How do the results get out to the decision makers? Do they have a hands-on tool that can be run in real time, or do they absorb the research via some other channel over a longer period of time and then rely on their mental models for decisions on the ground? And so on. And in a way, this all boils down to we're not so much trying to build models as build a modeling community that will continue to be productive and generate models that are interesting and fruitful, both in terms of advancing the scientific research agenda and in terms of advancing decision making. So how can we do that together? There are lots of possible questions on different time scales, ranging from kind of the tactical operational to the very strategic. And often these time scales are correlated with other kinds of scales. So spatial scales, typically if you're doing something tactical, you need spatial detail in order to decide where to put the people or the money or the ships. And on very strategic time scales, uncertainty may blur out a lot of the benefits of other kinds of detail. So you may be much more interested in kind of a top-down 50,000-foot view of the whole system. Then, of course, these scales intersect with other things like human decision-making scales of institutions and jurisdictions. We had a really interesting conversation about this diagram in one of the previous A sessions. This is just a conceptual view of the recovery process. So you have a system in which business as usual would have been essentially constant or steady state, maybe with some oscillation or noise around that steady state. And then an oil spill happens, which damages the system. And here we're looking at ecosystem services, but you could think of this conceptually as representing the health of a community or income of the fishing industry or other things like that as well. And after some time, the system recovers to its previous state. And if you spend some money on active restoration, it'll recover more quickly. So this is one possible view of the system, and it generated a bunch of interesting comments. So one was the note that the initial state of the system currently is not necessarily desirable in all ways. It's depressed already by forces other than the next oil spill. Another observation is that there may be things you can do to prepare in advance of the spill that diminish the size of the dip or have other effects that are beneficial. So it's not just a restoration and recovery game. And then there may be dynamics like restoration efforts that make things worse before they get better. Maybe they don't make the ecosystem worse, but they cost money. So in a political sense, things get worse before they get better. Political systems aren't that good at dealing with those kinds of things. So how do you manage that? Something you'd like to avoid is a irreversible or path-dependent effect that makes harm permanent. And the flip side of that is that we'd like to, rather than bouncing back to the original state, we'd like to, what somebody termed it, bounce forward and improve the outcome, or return to a system state that's better than what we started with. So essentially offsetting the initial depression. How's my audio? I'm getting an intermittent warning from Zoom that my connection is unstable. Are we okay so far?
Fine here.
Okay. I think it's just a fluke then. Any thoughts on this before we keep rolling? Okay, feel free to interrupt at any time with comments, questions, corrections, clarifications. And then finally, one thing I hope we'll talk about a little bit as we move through the structure of the system this morning is uncertainty. CJ mentioned to me in an email this morning that there's actually an ASTM standard for oil spill response models that requires an assessment of uncertainty. And certainly it's kind of standard operating procedure in research to generate confidence bounds on results and things like that. But it's far from being standard across all tools to generate simulations that represent uncertainty. And even if you did that, it's not clear what decision makers are going to do with the information. So I think as we think about models, we also want to be thinking about communication of risk and uncertainty, and how do we use the tools to help decision makers get into a mindset that's responsive to contingencies as opposed to attempting to predict the future and respond to the predictions.
Also, Tom, CJ had a comment on the chat box on the previous diagram.
Oh, I missed that. Actually, I see the chat box when my screen is shared. What's the essence?
She says that or CJ, would you like to state your question? I can read it for her. It says some systems do not recover to their previous state. For example, so spills with effects on seaweed have not seen the seaweed come back because other organisms moved in.
Interesting. So kind of an example of a path-dependent ecosystem change.
Can people hear me?
Yep.
This is CJ. Okay. Yeah, so there have been a number of spills that have had these seaweed effects where the glaciers come in and the seaweed doesn't reestablish. It was a large court case from Indonesia after the Montero spill. And the other thing is that since you mentioned that people don't know what to do with the uncertainty, and U.S. Coast Guard has been getting uncertainties from NOAA for operational decision-making for years. So I think the people that are doing response understand how to deal with that in terms of where they're going to deal with their risks. And Ann Hayward Walker is a really good person in terms of who's been working with Coast Guard on that. But I think the scientific community is what's new to the idea.
Interesting. So I guess they're then used to the question of they've got a piece of equipment that they need to deploy, and they have kind of a fuzzy, uncertain boundary for where the oil's going to be, and they're used to making that kind of decision. I would guess
it's not a fuzzy boundary for them; it's a line. So NOAA makes a best estimate of where the oil is going to go, and then puts an uncertainty estimate on the map. And so you can cross that outline of the uncertainty estimate for the trajectory and lay that over resources. And then they'll look for the most sensitive resources in which they'll say, okay, there's something of very high value. It's at a very low risk, but we're going to protect it anyway, even if the oil isn't predicted to go in that risk. Even if the highest probability is that it won't go there, there's a potential. And so they do that all the time. Mm-hmm. So the Coast Guard is used to seeing that.
So I would guess that on longer time scales, decision makers are not really so used to thinking that way. Even though you could draw other sorts of maps of, say, the probabilistic deposition of oil in various parts of the Gulf over long periods of time, integrating multiple spills, for example, that suggests prioritization of resources in different areas. But I would guess that there isn't kind of the infrastructure in place to think about it that way, the way say the Coast Guard would have.
Well, the Coast Guard does regular drilling activities where they'll do scenarios, and they'll go from tabletop drills to full scale to do deployments for things and to work out those types of questions. So they see a variety of this, and there's the EIS, ESI maps, which show a rating of risk for all of the natural resources in the area. So for the response aspects, in terms of so for the response, NOAA is providing 3 days of forecast so that the Coast Guard can get ahead. And then doing drill and preparedness, they'll do other aspects. And in the Deepwater Horizon, we were doing some longer forecasts to get them in terms of trying to get ahead of it.
Interesting. Okay. And does that get coordinated with, say, local jurisdictions on shore and other, people who are deciding whether to close beaches and things like that?
Yeah, so it depends on the size of the drill, but yes, it does, so that everybody knows how the system works and everybody knows how to contact the people in order to activate them. So government and state agencies would be involved in those, in the larger ones. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So again, it's back to the network of getting the people connected to the information and the decision makers connected to the information. Okay, interesting. Let's kind of revisit this thought as we move through the system. Any other comments? Okay, I'll keep going. Today we're focusing on kind of the bottom half of the diagram, the human health socioeconomic system boxes, which I think includes a lot of the decision making as well. So I want to talk about both the, well, really we'll just talk about everything. We actually had a lot of interesting socioeconomic conversation in the physics webinar last week. But hopefully we can focus on human health, socioeconomic system interactions, and on what the sort of the human boxes need from the physics and ecosystem boxes, and what they might provide. And so essentially, what's the feedback crossing these various boundaries? So here's the system structure that we wound up with after last week's physics call, and let me elaborate or walk you through this because it's a lot to digest in one piece. So we'll build it up. Here's the view roughly, and I'm stylizing a bit here just out of necessity. So here's the view of the system after the first webinar a month ago on human health, or after the first A session. So some key processes. So one is this this red path here, where you have oil spilled, you have transport processes determining where it winds up spatially. It winds up to some extent in the water where the fish are, which influences perceived safety, leads you to close certain fisheries. That has an impact on the seafood harvest, and that in turn has effects on income and employment in coastal industries, with a certain spatial distribution depending on the fate of the oil. So that was a perspective that we saw in the connectivity modeling system, and I think it also came up in a couple of other ways. So the CMS, for example, looked at how the spill impacted fishing industry revenue in socially vulnerable coastal communities. You could take that one step further and then look at the spillover from coastal industries to sort of the non-fishing economy, the service economy, and manufacturing and so forth, retail, all the things that depend on the fishing industry to some extent as well. That would be kind of another logical step. Then another set of things we talked about were essentially this pathway from transport of oil to toxic exposure. from a variety of sources. So you have exposure from cleanup activities, from other activities, and from consumption of seafood. And that then influences health status. So this was the Beaches model looking at long-term cancer and other chronic illness risk from exposure. And in order to figure out what the exposure is, it's partly a function of where is the oil, and it's partly a function of what are the human activities that expose people to oil, some of which might simply be ambient from living in a place. Then the third piece of the health webinars was mental health, which is related closely to community health and social capital and the sort of the resilience of the community, its access to outside resources and insurance and a variety of other things that make it robust to impacts, and also responds to income and employment. So we talked about, or we heard about impacts as a function of both direct exposure to oil, say by smelling it, and or interacting with it on the beach, and economic exposure to oil. And then from that flow a few other things. So for example, it was mentioned at some point that health status also affects the age structure of the population and family planning, which in turn affects population growth. And one can easily infer that it also influences productivity, which then feeds back to the economy, which is going to be, that closes the loop. So you have health status influencing productivity, influencing income and employment, influencing mental health directly, and influencing the health of the community, sort of the adequacy of the resources that it has to support people. And that also affects affordability of healthcare, whether you have the resources to pay for it, to sustain the local institutions that you need. So there's a set of feedback loops that are implied here that are in the sort of each of these links is somewhere in the literature, but they're not all literally in the same model. A couple of other things that showed up were effects of oiled shoreline on beach closures and therefore recreational opportunities. And that's another activity driver. And actually there should be a link to mental health as well from that. And actually physical health. Okay, so that's the beginnings of the system. So let's look at what we added in later meetings. Actually, before I leave that, any questions, observations on that? Okay, I'll keep going. Yep. So in the ecosystem conversations, we added basically a bunch of things over on the right here. So one was that this dense web of ecosystem interactions, which is still kind of necessarily cartoonish here. We don't have a full food chain, but we have fish and other things that aren't fish. They're both influenced by the spatial concentration of oil and dispersants and all the constituents. Somebody pointed out that it's not just oil, but it's hundreds or thousands of constituent chemicals of interest. And that gives rise to these ecosystem interactions. the permanent harm to seagrass from invasion of grazers is the kind of path-dependent ecosystem change that would be conceptually in this part of the system. It also suggests some additional dynamics in the economics of seafood harvest. So one is that closures are a function not just of perceptions of safety, but also of stock assessments affecting season length and equipment restrictions and so on. And the harvest itself, productivity of the harvest depends on the biomass of fish, and the harvest then, of course, diminishes the biomass of fish, which is why we do stock assessment and for resource management. So in this piece of the system, essentially you have the dynamics of resource management and optimization of the harvest yield. Then that influences some things that are in the socioeconomic system, consumer confidence, seafood prices, and based on its long-term fate or its long-term revenue prospects, the seafood industry will reinvest a certain amount of its resources in capacity or not. If harvests are down, then the industry doesn't invest, and there are probably tipping points below which you can't sustain a healthy seafood industry. And then finally, we talked about other ecosystem services, which are over here. So some of them are functions of, again, of biomass of various kinds. So say mangroves for coastal protection, seagrass for habitat, things like that. And maybe also wildlife species that are of particular existence value to people or of, say, recreational value to birders. So that's one of these links. And some of these things provide services, clean water or protection from storms, and these things interact not just with oil, but also with coastal development in general, other disturbances of land. And of course, there are other external forcings on the Gulf system like global climate, sea level rise. So that's the next piece of the system. Any comments before I keep going here? The other thing we added as we started moving into socioeconomic systems, we started talking about information and welfare. So you have welfare down here at the right, which is a function of the economy, jobs and income, but also non-market ecosystem services, the intrinsic value of knowledge from education, and of course, health status. So it's a mix of market and non-market things. So welfare, in a sense, over here is kind of the point of the system or the point of our efforts to manage the system anyway. But of course, welfare may look very different to different kinds of stakeholders in the system, depending on whether they say their income comes from coastal industry or their income comes from the non-fishing economy, and what their perception of the existence value of species is, and other kinds of differences. Also, maybe demographics, their existing health status, lots of different things. So up here, we recognized that kind of in the long run, education and knowledge have a big influence on perceptions of the system and also on whether people engage in risky behaviors. That's this link here. And information availability is also key to perceptions of safety and consumer confidence, which may or may not correspond with actual safety. So moving on, in the physics webinar, the picture got pretty big and I'd say a little bit out of control unless you take it in digestible pieces. So I'll just highlight a couple of additions that we talked about. So one was that the model that we'd been thinking of so far for the fate of the oil was about essentially the Lagrangian perspective on, we have a vector field for circulation, and oil is a particle that moves through that system. But what we recognized in the physics conversation is that oil is dynamically active, and therefore you'd really like to close the loop and have hydrodynamics explicitly in there so that the spatial concentration of oil and toxins is affecting transport. Then we also talked about, kind of on a related note, the orange bit about how ecosystem conditions and specifically microbes influence transport as well. And actually that link should be highlighted here. That's this link. And then there's some other ecosystem extensions as well that came up in the conversation. One was specifically about wildlife as a marker species within the sort of the other biomass, and the concern for oiled wildlife was a major driver of cleanup efforts. And the other being that the microbial community is of interest as well for the spread of infectious disease, which is an aspect of health status that was not considered in the previous conversations about health. And then we added a lot of material over on the left here in green, which is about response behavior and response capacity. So it's how the system in kind of a regulatory sense makes plans for a response, how it utilizes models, and how those plans then condition the overall cleanup and restoration effort, and also choices like use of dispersant. And there we also mentioned that there's essentially a set of experience curves for each of these things. So the choice of using dispersants or other technologies to some extent depends on the accumulation of past experience with those technologies, which affects economies of scale in deploying them in the future, and the availability of skilled people and equipment to deploy them, and confidence that it's actually going to work and not cause some kind of collateral damage. And then sort of part of that governance process is ultimately influenced by how people are perceiving impacts on welfare of communities, health of communities, and direct health risk directly, and so forth. And that's ultimately what is a major driver in kind of the balance of political forces that set up the regulatory framework that guides the whole response to begin with. So that's where we ended up last week. Oh, and there was one other observation, which is that another part of the sort of the information system was the media frenzy response. which is influencing perceptions of safety and influencing tourist behavior, and also the cleanup and restoration efforts directly, well as maybe long-term perceptions, and it's influencing mental health through creation of fear, or really could run the other way as well. If you have well-directed news coverage, it could allay fears as well as fan the fires. So that's the system as we have conceived it so far. Any comments, questions about this? Okay. And actually, before I leave this, I should just make a comment about the nature of this diagram. The idea here is to convey a sense of causality. So every arrow on this diagram is essentially an assertion that a causal link exists. So for example, over here, that other species, this link over on the far right here says that other species biomass is an important contributor to ecosystem services. And this one says that toxic exposure has an influence on health status, and it's causal, not merely a correlation. So this is kind of a conceptual model or conceptual framework, but it's a long way from being a real operable simulation model because it's just drastically underspecified. For every one of these links, we need to understand the shape of the relationship, which implies that there's some parameters that need to be measured or somehow acquired from other literature about that particular part of the system. And this diagram essentially doesn't distinguish between the state variables of the system and the rate processes that change those over time. So to turn this into a real model is a big job, and obviously there's a lot of detail that's also not evident. So we have hydrodynamics as a single variable here, but of course that implies temperature and salinity and other things on a three-dimensional spatial grid if you actually want to understand how that works and simulate it so that you can work out where the oil goes. Okay, thoughts, questions on that? Any major issues that we're missing?
I think you want to have a really, this is CJ, I think you want to have a really good understanding of the time scale for the different aspects of this. Because some of these are very short scale and some of them are longer term.
Right, and actually I'm hoping for next week I'll have a yet another version of this picture that separates the fast dynamics from the slow dynamics. For example, if you look at, I'll back up a little bit to a simpler view. If you look at this red process here of oil transport affecting fisheries closures, that's a pretty fast dynamic. And then as we build out the model, if you look at the seafood industry capacity response is a much slower dynamic. When closures affect harvest, doesn't mean you can immediately scrap all your fishing boats tomorrow. And same thing, within the ecosystem boxes. There are going to be things happening on a variety of time scales. And health is another area where that's a big deal. So toxic exposure is going to have maybe some immediate effects on health, but also some much longer term effects on things like cancer that are going to take a long time to emerge. And therefore the community will be affected on different time scales. And even within this box, for example, there are different time scales that really should be unpacked. So community health is partly long-term, intergenerational phenomena, the network of people on the coast and with the interior of the continent on long time scales from family ties, but then there's also much more immediate preparedness aspects of that. Do people have water or insurance or things like that might change very quickly?
Yeah. There's also timescales in which people of what they have to do. For example, if there's a notification of a spill, NOAA has 4 hours or 2 hours, unless it's a complicated situation, to provide the trajectory. So it's a very quick process. And then there's timescales along that. There's timescales in terms of what you're looking at for preparedness. Like the U.S. is in the process of redoing a number of their response plans now. And then once the spill initiates, there's timescales in terms of where decisions have to be made and when there's information needed. So if somebody has to build a model from scratch, I guess NOAA gets 4 hours if they don't have a free bathymetry for an area. They're just handed a map. So the type of model you can build and the uncertainty in that is very different than if you're doing something in a research setting where you've got several months in order to do it. And then the time scale for the decisions during the activities have some constraints on them.
Interesting. So essentially, a lot of that is over in this box of if you want to respond to anything in 2 hours, you need a plan in place in advance, and any models that you're going to use had better be kind of on the server ready to go.
That doesn't happen. Right. So if you've got an area so the U.S. has, say, 200 spills a year. All right. And most of those you don't have to run a model for. Say 10 of those you need to run a model for. You may not have the bathymetry, and there may not be a circulation model you can access. So then they've got so their modeling tools are developed to be very quick because they have to put something in place to get information to the responder under legal timescales. And from there, then the response moves into, say, there's trajectories twice a day, and then the Coast Guard has planning where they have to get ahead of the spill 3 to 5 days in order to start moving equipment and personnel ahead of the spill to clean. And then on the longer time scale, they're doing response plans and exercises to see how they are going to look at things. So there's a lot of levels in terms of what kind of physics and information you can get very quickly, what are the observing systems that are in place to provide data such as currents and other things, versus you're doing long-term planning. So looking at those timescales, building a model that you have to have ready in 4 hours versus building a model that you're going to have peer-reviewed are different things. And whether you're having something statistically relevant versus very operationally relevant of what the currents are today. And those timescales, I think, need to be considered.
Right. Okay, interesting. And then, so operating in kind of this part of the space here is very different from, say, coming up with a two-phase flow model to have better hydrodynamics and a better representation of the transport, which is a research program on a months to years scale that would only eventually percolate through into the models that are getting used in kind of the operational tactical sense.
Yeah, if it became tactical, then yes, but it's not like NOAA can say we can't do that. We don't have a model. They have their own tools for rapid development. And if you were to add to those rapid development aspects, then you would change NOAA's capabilities. Or, you know, we look around, NOAA would look around as, you know, in terms of planning and preparedness, engaging with people that had those types of models that were operationally running, then getting access to them.
Right. So NOAA must have a process at some level of formality for essentially scanning the environment or the portfolio of models that are out there in the universe and getting the state of the art into the tools that are actually in use in the response side of the system.
Well, the U.S. military works worldwide, and NOAA is responsible for that as well. So they have tools. They have tools where the modeler is handed a chart, and they have to be able to build a model and have a trajectory in 4 hours. I mean, that's their legal requirement.
Right.
And then since Deepwater Horizon, there have been more and more for universities that are providing operational access to their nowcast forecast system. So that's been a change. And it would be really good for this group to think about, in terms of models and activities, what other aspects could be made operationally relevant to the response. But it's really important to recognize that if NOAA makes a mistake in the trajectory and they're wrong, NOAA becomes a party to the damages. So that's one of the reasons for having the uncertainty, and that's one of the reasons for they're very careful with the types of tools they have, because the university folks that make forecasts don't get sued, but NOAA does, and they can be part of the damages if they're wrong.
Interesting.
This is Shui Chen. Can I make a comment on this point? So yeah, I'm working on the physical modeling side, couple modeling in terms of oil spill transport and things. So in terms of the research operations, this is a perpetual issue in the whole system. Weather forecast is the same. So research to operation translation has always been an issue that, in fact, GoMRI has a lot of research results, and how to move that into the operational system is something we should think about it, because I really think the models today is, in terms of operations, it's far less capable than the research part. And many of these research products cannot get into the operations because the system inside the NOAA and some other requirements and so on. So that's something that if people work in cross space and it can help, this process will definitely help. And the other comment I just want to sort of go back to is this time scale. So the time scale, we talked about the physical seminar the other day, is this from the physical modeling side to all the way to the ecosystem, back to human health, and across very long time scale. So something needs to be very quick and high resolution and the quality forecast in the short term, but that do impact the long-term part. So how to make onto this diagram is a challenge, but I think we definitely want to think about that, because right now, from physical side of things, we want to learn the time scales that take a lot of things influence the ecosystem influence things that we need to really build a model from physical side to deal with this long-term. For instance, the seasons is very different. If you have oil spill in the winter time versus springtime, it's very different, because the next few months in the summer, I have an upstream river that might start flooding, and a lot of the river runoff could influence the coastal region in a few months time scale that could well add to this issue of some things already influence the ecosystem. So far, none of this sort of a time connection are built into the system that deal with this thing in this very multi-scale stuff. So anyway, I just want to add those and see if other people might have a better idea how to get the system communicated better.
Great point. So part of the challenge then is that sort of this piece of the system is operating on a or at least if you're simulating it in detail, you're doing it in hours. And if you're interested in health status, you're thinking about years for emergence of cancer and things like that, especially if you're interested in how that influences productivity and income and the health of the community. That's all happening on a time scale of years. So presumably you don't want to run the hydrodynamics and transport model embedded in that so that you're running hourly for a couple of decades, just because that's not necessarily going to be very practical.
People that do response plans and long-term stuff do that. I mean, we do model runs that are really, really long, and you get long time series of models of, say, atmospheric and ocean circulation, and then you run the trajectory model thousands of times, and then you get statistics for what could happen and where things go. And that's where planning comes in, using those statistics for where you want to place response equipment, where you have sensitive areas and those things. So it's done on a sense, but I think that there's more research from GoMRI that's been done that can be added to that. But again, it needs error estimates on it, because people have to make decisions.
And especially, I guess, if you're thinking about the health of a coastal community or the health status of some group of individuals, that's going to be kind of acutely affected by one spill, but also is really a function of a bunch of other non-spill dynamics that are evolving over long time scales, which might not be captured in those models.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, other comments? So let me return here. So I guess we've really already started talking about this, but I'd like to continue with the inventory of what are we missing in terms of models and data, and in particular the connections among models and between the modelers or the models and the decision makers. And I guess I tend to think of this in a model-centric way, but it's not just about models. So there are things that are closer to the operational tools, monitoring systems, information systems for visualization or other kinds of digestion of the data that's out there, and models that are online or nearly online, so that you have rapid operational access to them. And then there are things that are more in the category of diffusion of knowledge and insights, research results, and also kind of operational rules of thumb or case studies of where things worked or didn't work in the past. And then finally, there's the people network, which is, if you don't know, if you don't have a model ready to hand to solve a problem, and you don't have any research that bears on the particular question that you're trying to answer, at least you know where in the network to access people who do know about these things or can advise you. So actually, one possible use of this conceptual framework for the system is as a roadmap into the research on each of the variables or the links that are shown here, so that you can look at this and think about quickly the kinds of things that are connected to the concept you're interested in. So if you're interested in health status, what's influencing that, and what do you have to consider to think about how that will evolve, and then use that as a pointer into the relevant research. That's something that could be built off of a map like this, or there might be other ways to organize it. Put it in a hierarchy or something like that. But in any case, using the kind of the conceptual framework as a way to get access, not just to tools, but also to people and more detailed research in the system. So I'm going to just throw out a few ideas about things that look like they are missing, specifically from the socioeconomic side of the system. And then sort of your job is to extend the list and critique and refine what I'm suggesting here. So I've listed 5 categories, and basically I got this again from looking at this diagram and saying, okay, what are the major processes that are going on here, primarily in the bottom half where we're talking about socioeconomic systems. I wasn't thinking particularly about physics and ecosystems yet. We'll talk about that on Thursday. So 5 kinds of things at least. One is the connection from direct economic impacts on, say, fishing or tourism into the general regional economy, looking at what are the economic spillovers. Another is community modeling, essentially what's in a community, what are the resources and states, and how are they evolving, both on short-term spill response and long-term, more general community health and resilience. The health system is a major component of that. And then actually on number 4, there may be a lot more out there that I simply don't know about, so we can talk about that a little bit. The 5th one is kind of a meta level category, which is simply thinking about how decisions get made in general. Certainly a central topic in socioeconomic systems. So number is the regional economy. So in, for example, the CMS work, that looked at the effect of closures on seafood harvest and therefore on income in communities. And that was cross-referenced with the social vulnerability index for those communities. So you could look at where the income reductions hit hardest on communities that were most vulnerable to that to begin with. So the next extension of that is to connect the kind of the fishing and tourism industry impacts to the non-fishing economy and to population and migration. And that could easily be done with regional economic models, IMPLAN, REMI, things like that, where you have a detailed local economy with a characterized by an input-output table or social accounting matrix. And some of those at least extend kind of around the fringe of the input-output framework to tell you things about jobs, population migration, and property values, I think, too, are in REMI, for example. So that seems like a pretty straightforward and I'd almost say obvious thing to do that we, at least I haven't heard about yet. So that's certainly a potential refinement or extension of the framework that takes existing results and information and plugs it into one more component of the system to get a more comprehensive picture of the impacts out of that.
But isn't that the damage assessment? So that's the legal, so that information is developed for the legal case, right? So groups of people create the damage assessment, and then that's part of what goes into the court case, and then the damages have to be paid by the responsible party.
So I don't know to what extent BP actually was responsible for indirect damages.
Oh yes, they were.
How does that get paid out? Does it get paid to communities?
It gets paid to the it gets paid out in a variety of ways. So there's the oil spill happens, and then there's the response. And as the response is going on, there is also the assessment of the damages being done separately from the operational work. And that damage assessment continues on for quite a while afterwards. So in Deepwater Horizon, BP was doing an assessment and the government was doing an assessment. And so that's from economics down to, personal scale, to personal injury, down to ecosystem services. And then that's what goes into the court case. There's a settlement. And then from that settlement, there's a dispersal of the funds in terms of, how the restoration and other things are planned for use of that funding. And what was unusual in this case is that BP made an agreement towards the damage assessment early to provide upfront money that would be counted towards their total damage assessment bill, but they gave it to create GoMRI to do research now on what was going on. But that money, that GoMRI is part of that damage assessment fund.
Right, that was the $20 billion they set aside more or less immediately in trust.
So that was
So it's interesting. This kind of assessment doesn't show up easily in outside the GoMRI literature because there isn't there's some community health metrics and so on, but there isn't really an area of the GoMRI literature that focuses on cost-benefit analysis and economic modeling. But it also doesn't show up in Google Scholar. So I'll spend a little more time digging for this, but it sounds like it's an area
I can help you find it.
That would be great.
Yeah, if you want. Yeah, I can help you find that.
My experience with models in legal cases is sort of a variation of the legal, sort of the old saw that hard cases make bad law. It's not a great environment for modeling, so it seems like something you'd want to be kind of more systematic and to be happening outside of the environment of a court case, just so that you can have a more friendly academic debate about the validity of models rather than an adversarial debate, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's number one. Other questions, comments, thoughts on this particular prospect? So now I think there's a downside to these kinds of models, which is that they have lots of sectoral details. They tell you how the fishing industry relates to the restaurant industry, and then how that drives retail sales and all sorts of other spillovers. So you get a very dense network of connections among activities. The problem is that there are some key activities in these models that don't really have a functional representation. So there's, for example, an education that is educating, consuming resources and producing some GDP, but it's actually not increasing the aggregate skill level of the population or doing anything like that that would be changing the productivity and the happiness and behaviors of people in the future. So some key off-market dynamics are missing in this framework. So I think the second thing you need is to look at the community more directly. And actually, so in the long run, you want kind of a functional dynamic model of the community that includes things like health status and educational attainment, and other kinds of off-market social amenities as explicit components of the model. So you'd give up some of the sectoral detail. You don't any longer care so much about transportation versus retail versus legal services and all the other things that are in the social accounting matrix, but you do care more about quality of life and migration of people and how skills and health translate to productivity and therefore ability to generate the resources that sustain the community, that pay for the health care and pay for the schools and things like that. And actually, we've done city models of this scope that also include things like tax rates and so on. So you might want those kinds of things explicitly in the model. So there's kind of a missing model, which is a long-term community model, which is not centered around social accounting matrix, although that would be a rich source of data for constructing such a model. Not clear to me who will build this model. I think it would be fun. Then in the short run, there's also a set of things to consider, so it sounds like these may be actually in the domain of the response and contingency plans, which is looking at community response. So this is from a model of post-disaster relief efforts. So this is a model of the receipt of material where you get a mix of things that are kind of acquired through the professional relief effort, and then a lot of non-priority items that come from sort of volunteer relief efforts or poorly targeted but well-intentioned attempts at relief, and you have to somehow process all this material and get it out to people. So this is kind of the logistics of relief. You could imagine a lot of other aspects of this that could be modeled. Preparedness, whether you have stocks of various kinds of material that you need to respond to a situation on hand prior to a spill or a storm or whatever the particular emergency is. So it sounds like some of this is happening in the contingency planning in the Coast Guard and NOAA processes already.
I'm sorry, what's NP? That's a silly question.
Non-priority. So this is, you know, I think the details of this are not so important as the key point here is the the possibility of modeling such things, of modeling the response itself as a project or a logistics process. You know, essentially it's a combination of it's a supply chain. You need certain materials and capital equipment and so forth to respond to a problem, and human resources, and how do you get them where they need to be in a timely fashion. So to do that, partly you need the guiding information. You need that input on certain forecast of where the impacts are going to hit. And then you also need to understand what are the delays in allocating these resources and moving them to the needed locations and things like that. And what are the various pathologies that can make things go wrong. So for example, one pathology in this model is kind of in the middle here, that if you're trying to manage the material flow for relief supplies, if you get a lot of unsolicited non-priority stuff, then you're buried in material and your handling rate goes down because you can't sort the wheat from the chaff, and your warehouses are overflowing, and you know your logistics are clogged with things that you can't process. So it would actually be better to have less stuff to deal with.
So NOAA has the trajectory analysis planner model, which looks at how much, has skimmers with their capacities, requirements for boom for, we know in the U.S. how much boom is needed for every beach. Right? The Coast Guard has developed that information. And so there's models in terms of looking at capacity, whether or not you want more skimmers versus more boom. And then when new response plans are being done, there are large statistical trajectories that are done to estimate the amount of equipment a particular area will need for their worst case scenarios, and also where to place it.
Cool. So this may be to some extent covered, and what's needed is more of a line extension than it is a new domain.
Yes, I would say that's true. Because in order to do the planning, it's just the sort of the similar trajectory model. It's just used differently, in terms of whether or not you look at the modeling for how long it takes to get the boom to a specific place versus, and then looking at the response options, and then the drill procedures where they're doing different level, either from tabletop to full scale, where they're moving equipment. Their Coast Guard is doing that type of assessment all the time.
Interesting. And actually, on top of that, I guess there is kind of a global disaster relief intellectual community that is thinking about these kinds of things. Actually, that's where this model comes from.
Yeah. So so there's different tiers of response. So when you're looking at so there's what each country has. So you think about what the U.S. has, and then there are transboundary agreements for aid. So like between Mexico and the U.S. and Canada and the U.S. And then there's the Tier 3 response, which is Oil Spill Response Limited. They have 5 large equipment stations around the world. They're the people that have the 5 capping stacks. So they're in a Tier 3 response. That worldwide cache of response equipment is brought to bear and is flown in to help. So they have a plane specially built for a capping stack to show that they can get the capping stack, into place quickly. As much as it wouldn't. I mean, if you had a well blowout, there's actually a lot of damage that has to be cleared before you can put the capping stack on. But yeah, there are small scale exercises from community to statewide, to national to international that are done continuously.
Right. And then I guess a lot of the community responses also must be in the domain of FEMA and state agencies who are kind of in the business of making sure that people have shelter and water and blankets.
Yeah, there's a national response framework now, which includes oil spills and other types, both natural and anthropogenic disasters, in terms of how high up the chain you go, in terms of how much of the from local, state to federal government gets involved in order making decisions.
So it sounds like the missing piece is more on this long-term dynamics side. They're, looking at how education and equity and poverty and income and insurance and all of these things interact to make a community resilient or not to some kind of catastrophe that affects, say, a core industry like fishing or tourism. All right, let's keep rolling here. A third thing, and we actually talked about this in the physics a little bit. The diagram here is from the Beach's model, which is taking fate and transport of oil, of actually lots of constituent chemicals from the physics side, and then combining that with a database of activities, human behaviors, which are to generate exposure, which then gives you, which you then combine with information about the toxicology of each constituent chemical and the exposure to get health risks out of the system. So there's some obvious line extensions to that work. One would be to add infectious disease to this, which has a little bit more dynamics, I think, than chemical exposure. And then another would be to essentially do the analogous thing for mental health risk. So you have the same idea. From fate and transport and activities, you can infer the exposure, both the economic exposure, as in the connectivity modeling system work on fishing industry income, and the actual direct toxic exposure from beach play and things like that. Combine that with the research, which is, I think, quite a bit thinner on the ground, but nevertheless still somewhat available on kind of the mental toxicology of these exposures, and get the same kinds of health risks out of the system. So that would be kind of a line extension of that work. I don't know if, I think Helena's on the call, if that's in the works or...
Yeah, this diagram was presented by Alicia, and it was part of our proposal that we submitted. What we're currently doing is the line that corresponds only to the child beach play. Getting the concentration to initiate the model really depends on the ability of the fate and transport model to simulate, to extend the individual contaminant concentration so that you can then forecast risk.
Mm-hmm.
And this particular framework, in order to do this extension, it would be based on a Monte Carlo type simulation where you would have probability distributions for each one of these parameters that are in the list. And then you would use that simulation to come up with probabilities of impact in different areas, or probability of health risks from the impact in different areas.
Yep. So let's see. So when you say distributions, is it kind of all in? So one obvious thing would be that the where the oil is going to land is uncertain, and another would be that the risk profile of each constituent chemical is potentially quite uncertain.
Every step of the way would have an uncertainty.
Yeah.
Even the level of the concentration, which chemicals, how the children play on the beach, every parameter that would go into that exposure would have its own distribution.
So, so that suggests some connections to kind of both actually to two things. So one is over here on the freight and transport, more infrastructure for sort of that generated and stored and made accessible the scenarios from the models on the physics and ecosystem side would be helpful. Is that correct?
Yes. Better estimates of concentration to start with, and impact location for oil spills. What we've been, in looking at the data, what we've observed is that you can look at the chemical signatures along the near shore, and although the model may predict an impact, it's not reflected in the chemical signature. And then in other places, you'll see an impact from the chemical signature, but the model doesn't predict an impact in those areas. So even coming up with that, improving the certainty with those predictions would greatly help in this whole process.
Right. So it's partly just easier access to the scenarios, but also lowering the variance on what you're taking in. And I guess at least for retrospective work, the monitoring system is important as well as the model.
Yeah. Yes, and the design of that modeling system as well. But I wanted to also add, because you had also mentioned using something similar for mental health risk.
Yeah.
And in terms of mental health risk, I think it would be, this is more of a physical, straightforward, but mental, I think, is so much more complex. And it's not only aspects that surround the person in terms of their house being damaged or vulnerability indexes in terms of their social networks, but it's also the media as well. So I think that for mental health, there'll be a completely different way of approaching it.
So, yeah, so, well, let's see. Yeah, so mental health is driven by media frenzy, income and employment, and kind of the more general health of the community, which is encompassing things like social networks and whether people's daily activities are interrupted. Oh, and we should add recreation to this as well, since that's a important driver of, and actually that probably should be connected to physical health as well. So it's these red links that I just added here, and those are then driven by income and employment. So there probably are more things. But on the other hand, looking at David Abramson's work, they were able to at least measure odds ratios for mental health impacts on the basis of the same kinds of toxic exposure that you were measuring, and also economic exposure in the sense of the way it came out of, say, the CMS work, from you're out of work because the fisheries closed, for example, or because the beaches are closed and no tourists are coming. So it seems like at least a rough assessment could be made on that kind of basis.
It would be nice to have some sort of similar model to this for mental health, and then the output from the mental health would probably go back into physical health, because our mental health really does significantly influence the physical.
Yeah, absolutely. And it might also affect the activity factors or the risky behaviors that people are engaging in as well, especially if you start considering where people are getting their information about what's safe or not safe. I think
seems like it'd be really
yeah,
to
go
have
ahead.
this with identifying if we need to close more beaches than we think we do. Like, because the bait and transport model would tell us where to close beaches, but I think this other health system might give us more information on other beaches we would close for other reasons.
Mm-hmm. And actually, I think you mentioned that, you know, there are maps of critical resources along the coast, and you target your response efforts to sort of defend those resources. One output of this, where it mentions GIS mapping, might be to essentially add another layer to those maps where the risk profile is particularly important.
Yeah, so if we have environmental sensitivity index maps, and that's maybe a new type of layer for social sensitivity index maps.
Yeah, that would be cool. And then, of course, the output from this also feeds back to kind of the long-term viability of communities on pretty long-term time scales, I think, when you start thinking about how the incidence of cancer and other things starts to impose loads and costs on the healthcare system, which ultimately propagate through to the communities and individuals who are involved.
I always almost, in response to CJ's comment about closing more beaches, I was almost thinking about it in the opposite way, to really emphasize to the community that not as many beaches need to be closed. Or there was a huge perception at the time of DWH that the whole Gulf Coast, including all the entire state of Florida, was covered with oil. And if there was a way to illustrate the health impacts with more certainty, that there wouldn't be as much avoidance because of the perception is bigger than what the actual impacts were.
Yeah, you're right. The beaches that were closed are very different. There's the aspect of protection, which is closing the beaches, but there's also the action of the human decision not to go to the beach, even if the beach is open.
Right. So there may have been an overreaction in terms of avoidance from kind of the fear and loathing effect spread by the media frenzy, as John Shepard put it, I think.
Mm-hmm. And that's a part of the damage assessment. I mean, you have to pay for the spiller has to pay for lost revenue from people not wanting to go to the beach.
Mm-hmm. So actually that suggests some things that are going on in, I'm just going to skip around here, in decision making in general. You know, so there are lots of decision processes that certainly are ripe for analysis, I think, in the socioeconomic domain. And I know these things get studied a lot in other contexts, but it's things like risk perception and communication and media distortion and amplification of information, and how best to use social media and other tools to reach people with appropriate information. So it's about the links I've highlighted in red here. How does consumer confidence work, and which beaches and fisheries should you be closing based on real risk versus perceived risk? Recognizing that the perceptions are sometimes as important as the reality. And probably there are aspects of decision making in kind of the regulatory framework, particularly the political aspects of that, and improving kind of the management science of improving the contingency plans and how the responsible party behaves as well, that ought to be within the socioeconomic systems domain as well. That's not in the GoMRI literature, but I think there's a lot of that in other literature that could potentially be integrated.
I think the Exxon Valdez is a really good case in terms of there were the people that gave their fishing boats to say, yeah, we're going to help you any way we can. And then there's the group that just said, no, we don't want to help you. We hate you because you had a spill. And the people that gave their boats to help in the response all got brand new boats. And that created an economic divide between the people that didn't get all new boats and fishing equipment versus the ones that did. And that economic stratification still exists.
Interesting. Yeah, and I would imagine in a small community like a fishing community, that would create a lot of bad blood from, you know, sort of perceptions of who sold out and who didn't.
Yeah, there's a line of research in terms of, you know, human aspects of spill response and societal aspects. Perception is a huge aspect of that.
Yeah, so
truth.
right, truth versus perceptions, where the perceptions are what are going to actually drive the decision making. So how do you get that better aligned? So that would be a great stream to get integrated with kind of the more physical or the more scientific aspects of what's in the GoMRI research portfolio.
Yeah, there's a lot of research on human dimensions of oil spills that's published.
Okay, a couple of other things. Let's see. Well, so I'll mention in the same vein, and it sounds like actually this is happening, just not in a domain we've talked about yet. Logistics, both in the long run and the short run of spill management, would be another important area to look at. Sounds like that's already happening. So maybe the agenda here is to figure out how to get the state of the art out of the science and into the models here. And then I think the last piece is kind of the community to health nexus, which, as we were saying a few minutes ago when we were talking about the beaches model, is pretty complex, especially when you get into mental health and the healthcare delivery system. Certainly there are other models that look at kind of community health in terms of the load on local healthcare institutions. I'm not aware of one specifically that closes the loop through from health status to economic productivity to income and employment and the availability of the resources to kind of continue to run the community and provide health care and avoid mental health impacts in the future. But that seems like a pretty rich domain. And of course, even if we can't build the model today, at least identifying the research that corresponds with each link or each variable on this diagram in a way that would give you a roadmap to start thinking about community health and resilience would be a useful step forward, I think. So what else? What other opportunities are implied by the pieces of the system that we haven't talked about yet?
I think there's two things we haven't talked about. One is a spill that's very different from the Deepwater Horizon, and one that's very Arctic as opposed to very temperate.
Ah, um, and when you say a spill that's different, what would be an example? Scale or something else?
Well, I have a paper that I have one paper published and another a larger scale in submission that if you had a spill like the Deepwater Horizon off of Angola, then you would have large areas subsurface that went hypoxic even before you considered subsurface dispersant injection. There are other aspects in terms of the types of organisms, you know, and being able to, like in responding in ice, you have much more in terms of issues related to the response, how you're going to do it, you know, cold weather.
And actually then I guess you could extend that to all kinds of local conditions. So another problem in Angola would be that you don't have the infrastructure that you have in the Gulf.
You have different infrastructure. I mean, the major companies that are doing development, they're the worldwide companies, like BP has worldwide infrastructure. The bigger issue is really the small spills. You know, there are 200 on average, say 200 oil spills in the United States a year. Very few of them require running a model, and very few of them even make the news. But there's a lot of scale planning and figuring out being creative to figure out what it is that we haven't seen before is what's going to most help us for these new situations. And that's one of the harder things to think about. But we can do a lot of drills, but if we haven't anticipated all the quirks, we haven't practiced them.
Right. How about community impacts in some place like Angola where there aren't many resources on shore? You know, you don't have a FEMA, and the coastal communities have relatively little in the way of capital. I would imagine that could be quite different as well.
I would imagine that was, and that would be like so other countries, you know, whether or not they're really active in planning versus not is very different.
So you could imagine, so that's an interesting kind of conceptual extension here. You could imagine that this diagram has maybe a similar structure but very different parameters when you transplant it to a cold environment or a poor environment or one with different geometry or something.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Anything else? Anyone else want to chip in?
Hi, Tom. I just want to let you know that Peter Edwards also put a note in the chat box. Peter, do you want to expand on your note?
Hi, can everyone hear me?
We can.
Yes, I guess it's a little further down the track, but just I just thought looking at the diagram, and it is embedded in the links there, but it seems, you know, naturally to be very focused on the impacts of the oil spills, since, you know, oil spills are usually very deleterious. But there might be a way to represent the inherent resilience in the system and the service, the ecosystem service that the actual ecosystems provide in mitigating the actual impacts of these spillage. So, for example, if you have, you know, marsh grasses, you know, the quantity and quality of that marsh grass might, and surface area might actually impact how quickly or how well that particular system deals with the environmental insult. And I know it's kind of like, you know, you can see there in the threads, but I just noticed that, you know, the diagram, rightly so, is mainly focused on the impacts to the ecosystem and not necessarily the kind of inherent resilience of the system itself. It's just an observation, nothing too critical. I know it's kind of embedded there, but just something I noticed when I looked at the diagram.
Yeah, so that's, and actually that's true, I think, on the community side as well. There's an idea of resilience, or the system's ability to respond, to kind of rebound to a good state, as opposed to suffer permanent damage on the basis of its existing state. And that's, you know, sort of embedded in this piece at the moment, but this doesn't really capture the richness of the food web and kind of the, you know, the reefs as habitat for other species and all the kinds of rich interactions that are going on in there. And I guess that also then suggests another class of thing that's important, which is other impacts on that ecosystem state that may make it more or less resilient. So there's one arrow here which is representative of that, which is from coastal development to other species biomass, but really that's a much richer thing. So it's not just whether there's coastal development, but how much is it and where is it, and is it done well or poorly, and then there may be lots of other effects, you know, transports of nutrients down rivers and things like that that are also influencing that system. Is that the spirit of the kind of thing you were thinking of?
Yep.
Yeah. So that also suggests thinking about the kind of the connections between human health and socioeconomics and physics and ecosystems. What do we need? So one thing that would be useful then is kind of a richer set of connections between the very detailed ecosystem models and physics models that we already have and the ecosystem services that are provided through that chain of causality, essentially. So I guess the question is, how do we get better connected to that? One thing that was suggested in one of the early webinars, I think by Natalie, was that having a repository of scenarios, kind of analogous to the Climate Model Intercomparison Project repository in the climate integrated assessment world, would be really useful, because you then have access to a big library of spatially detailed results from models, and maybe also observations in the same framework, that can be input to other kinds of models about coastal economies and things like that. Then you can kind of build the models on a test bed of realistic physics and ecosystems data and results, and then later you can close the loop and have feedback between the socioeconomic and health systems and the behavior that's driving the physics and ecosystems response. But there might be other ways to get that as well, you know, APIs for linking up models directly, or kind of thinking about the people side of things, joint meetings that bring together people in diverse modeling domains. And, you know, ultimately, if people are going to do something, they need funding. Does anybody have particular opinions about what they're hungry for from the physics and ecosystem domain, and what might help them to get that? Are there any? Yeah, go ahead.
It sounds like what you want is a better connection to where many of the damage assessments have been filed, right? So that whole literature in terms of real case studies and what happened. Because finding peer-reviewed literature is pretty straightforward for someone who works at a university, but finding the legal literature of what happened in old case studies may be much more difficult. And certainly there have been a lot of damage assessments that have been done that people could look at in terms of what they thought happened and what its value was. I mean, there's those things happen all the time.
Yeah, I guess what would be interesting, so that's an interesting aspect that I actually hadn't considered here is just how do you get at all those past damage assessments. I mean, it seems like there ought to be meta-analyses of these things. I know there are models that are kind of statistical models of cleanup costs based on a variety, sort of a characterization of the scale of the spill and where it happened. But you could generalize that to other kinds of damages as well, and I haven't seen that. But again, I'm a generalist. None of this is my specialty. So that sounds like one fruitful thing. But I guess I was thinking more in terms of systematizing this so that when, you know, if some groups get together to compare their hydrodynamic or their coupled atmosphere ocean models and they generate a bunch of transport scenarios for a hypothetical oil spill, that output goes into some kind of online archive, which then somebody could come along as a socioeconomic modeler could come along and take that and say, okay, here's how much beached oil there is in a set of stochastic scenarios, and use that as the input to drive their model of a coastal community economy or whatever it is that they're interested in.
So that type of work is done by Bessie and Bohm, and it's published. So it's not hard to get the reports of how that's been done. But in order to, I'm not sure what else you would look at, because you're going to the realm of where the commercial oil spill models that are the fully integrated ones, where they live, and like there's the damage assessments which provide the large analysis. I mean, reading the damage assessment from the Persian Gulf War and the oil spill there is pretty amazing. To the systems in terms of the agencies that are looking at what are the overall effects and how do we develop the response plans.
And so that's kind of on the, so that's interesting. So I think there's a kind of a separate stovepipe that we have for damage assessment that we haven't interacted much with in the webinars we've talked about so far, on more on the research side. But presumably if you those damage assessments don't include some of the long-term community dynamics and resilience concepts, just because nobody's modeled that yet.
Yeah, I don't think, no, they don't come to the point of where how you could improve in terms of resilience. That may be, I think that would be a good aspect in terms of what Bessie funds, in terms of improving, they're in the process of redoing all the number of the response plans. So they put out an RFP for a group to do this work, and it usually involves an oil spill modeling group, an operational group, an economics group like PCCI, to work together in terms of developing those response plans. And if you wanted to include resilience in that, that would be an interesting aspect.
It's certainly a question that's on people's minds a lot. If you look at the Sea Grant questions on the socioeconomic side, there are a lot of questions about community resilience and community impacts that I think are not modeled yet because they're complex. Who's the funder that you mentioned there? It sounded like you said Bessie, but is that an acronym?
Yeah, Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement and Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. So after Deepwater Horizon, part of the court case required the Minerals Management Group to be split into 3 agencies.
That's the Minerals Management Service in the USGS?
The Minerals Management Service, yeah, and it's not part of the USGS.
Oh,
so
okay.
Minerals Management Service was an agency, and it was determined that, I forget the name of the 3rd agency, but the 3rd agency takes the royalties from the oil industry, and then Bessie does safety and enforcement, so they do development related to safety, and then Bureau of Ocean Energy Management does the oil development plans. And it was considered a potential fostering that contributed to having an accident was to have agencies that receive money from oil spills involved in the groups that regulate the developers. Yeah, so that agency was broken apart into 3 groups.
Interesting incentive problem. Okay. Is there anything further on the front of getting kind of the health and socioeconomic research out to decision makers that should happen? Is the frontier, making, or are we ready to build tools that they could interact with directly, or is it more a matter of connecting up people to people? Or do we need to advance the research frontier before the information can, really start having an impact on decisions? I don't know, Helena, if you have an opinion on where you are on beaches and.
Well, the decision makers that I think about mostly are the beach managers and the Departments of Health, who have the authority to open and close beaches. I know from conversations with those who were working through Deepwater Horizon and trying to make decisions about what to do in the local community and in the Departments of Health. I do believe that there was some lack of communication in some cases, and it was a little slow in coming. My sense was that at the very beginning there was a lot of questions and decision makers needed information right away, and they had the public coming at them asking questions. Mm-hmm. But after a certain period of time, I would say on the order of several weeks, things. Everyone became organized, and then there was more unified messaging that happened after the fact. So maybe one interesting aspect that was discussed earlier is I thought it was fascinating to hear from CJ that all of the drills and the planning that goes on in oil spill response in terms of the physical response to the oil, but maybe something similar, and maybe this is already happening with the decision makers, but something similar in terms of how to do the communications during these periods of time amongst all of the agencies that are involved, from the federal all the way down to the local level.
Yeah, this idea of drilling seems really productive, because then, you know, if you put people kind of in the situation, even just around a big table or something, the questions come up that wouldn't have occurred to them just thinking about the problem. And then you can design the information channels to serve those.
It would probably be a really good idea if we could develop some sort, or a project could be developed to identify new stakeholders related to oil spill response that we didn't know of before Deepwater Horizon. Because when you have a spill of national significance, you have a lot more people involved than in a local small one. And that would be a really good gap to fill.
Interesting. Also a great topic kind of in the domain of social sciences. All right. Well, it's 10 o'clock my time, noon some of your time. So I'd say let's call it a wrap. We will continue this conversation on Thursday, thinking about it more from the physics and ecosystems side, although hopefully it will be as kind of wide-ranging conversation as this one, where we can really appreciate that everything's connected to everything else. And then on the 11th, we will have a wrap-up conversation where we kind of come at it from all sides and summarize the overall outcome and suggestions for next steps and so forth. So thanks everybody for your input, and I'll look forward to talking to many of you again.
Thanks, Tom.
All right, thanks.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank you. Hi, okay, I think we lost Tom. I see Chuck is still on. We just lost John Shepard, but I thought, well, we can go over this tomorrow during the 9 a.m. Eastern meeting.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds good. It'd be good to have some feedback on, you know, course correction for Thursday.
Yeah, yeah. So I thought the discussions were very interesting, fascinating. I learned a lot in the process. So we'll talk tomorrow morning, real early.
Sounds good.
Okay, thanks.
All right, have a good one.
Bye.